Hello, this is episode 70 of the podcast called Blood and Rain. I'm your host, Arthur Dane. And today we have a guest from someone who's a bit in the midst of the dissident right and some other circles and some more inflammatory circles in and out of it regarding. Goes by the moniker Luthemplar, formerly Cringewalker, if you're familiar with his Twitter conquests in the past. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, and planning on eventually renaming it again to Aleph. I think it is set to that on my name here. I like the Greek word truth more than the Greek word freedom now. The more into the dissident right I've gone, the less I've been a fan of all the French Revolution terms, and the more classical terms have become more favorable to me. Aleph Templars is the Thorn Templar there comes from like the warrior, the ancient warrior, the Knight's Order, and the Aleph is the Greek that gets added on to there. It used to be Eluth, which is the Greek for freedom or enlightenment, really. But I didn't like that. Now that I hate the Enlightenment, I'm like, maybe I should change it to something better.
It's very Christopher Marlowe. As your point of view keeps changing, you keep changing, your appearance, your name.
Yeah.
I like it because
Go on.
It's kind of the opposite of these guys who, they had to dig their feet in the ground and later on they like realize they're wrong and like, well, I'm gonna try to keep elements of this that way I cannot, have egg on my face. But you're kind of like, no, I was wrong. I don't like this anymore. So
yeah, well, there was I've said many times the reason why I chose the name Cringewalker originally was because of AA's pro-Empire posting a while back, which I think he recently just did another quick YouTube short about it, but it was for its time. And many people said I shouldn't change my name because I was so well known by that name, but I mean, I like tripled in size once I did, so I guess I proved them wrong. I don't know if I'm going to keep proving them wrong though.
Yeah, it's always like the old guard of like the cult favorite that sometimes may slow you down a little bit. It's like it's very much it's equivalent to people who were a fan of a band in like their early days and then like refine their sound and get more popular. Like, man, you weren't even there in the beginning. Yeah. Like, you don't even know. I've been guilty of that with my dark hipster past from high school, but yeah, I've since lightened up a little bit. Although for the most part, I'm very pro gatekeeping. But yeah, so. You're kind of the second guest that I've had in this neck of the woods, Jay Burden being the first. I'm familiar with you because of Jay Burden. Familiar with Jay Burden because of, the likes of T7 and Morgoth and AA that I started getting into about 2-3 years ago, but really a lot more heavily a year ago. So I'm still in this process of kind of introducing all these players to my audience. It mainly comes from Instagram. It comes from the people who are now establishing what's called Careless Press, which is our joint effort of all the creators on that side of things. But we found out about a year ago that we're pretty isolated. Not too many people know what we're doing. I think the first to really cross over was Anacreon when he was on Alex Kashuta's podcast. So for the sake of, introducing yourself to a new audience, could you just describe, who you are, why you started posting, and where your content's going?
I've been following vaguely on the outer rings of right-wing stuff for years. I consider myself fairly center or possibly even left-wing for a while, but nowadays I don't really ascribe to left or right at all. And my main thought, I guess I could take you back to like 2014, 2016 when I was a wee little college kid, and I just kind of felt like there was an increasingly, it was definitely the term anti-white gets used nowadays. Back then, in all technical aspect, it was just anti-American. It was anti-patriot, as they called it back then, in the libertarians and everything. I don't know. It was kind of like a hodgepodge of different political climates, but I grew concerned about it. I'm not like entirely like some pure-blooded someone. I've said many times I'm I'm basically like 8% Jewish from my great grandmother, and a mix of Irish and very Slavic peoples. If I did a DNA test once and got random Mongolian genes, so I'm like kind of like a mudblood. But I didn't like the direction of politics back in the right before Trump came into the scene, and I'm not even a very good fan of Trump, but there just seemed to be something a little like you had the sense that someone was getting ready to pull a trigger, and there's still I think like since 2020 that the evidence of that has grown, and I'm just like, well, there's something wrong with the political cultural environment of America and the general West. Like it really is seemingly self-destructive and suicidal. And at a fundamental level, like why aren't you allowed to enjoy your origins anymore? Like the old left-wing kind of Benite side of me still thinks that everybody deserves to like have a joy of their origin. Everybody should like enjoy their tribe. Everyone should have this like not pride, but like a certain sense of like, yeah, I am that. I come from that, and it has a right to exist, regardless of who. As I've gotten older, I've kind of tended to be a little bit more aware that the Bible gives different blessings and cursings to different people. But not in. I don't think that's like outside of the redemptive power of Christ or anything. It's just like you start with a certain like min max in the game of life, and Christ can help you get over that.
Yeah, I mean, I think coming from where you are in your neck of the woods, I don't think it's a secret that you're a native New Yorker.
Yeah.
When you come from a place like that, that's so heavily, dare I say, diverse, you're sandwiched in with a bunch of people. You're packed like a sardine in the subway, depending on what time of day you're going. And you have a bunch of different people and a bunch of different customs and ideas and different eras in just such a compressed environment. If you don't start to look around, you're kind of just closing your eyes completely. Although New York is probably the best place to disappear if you really want to be left alone, because everyone's in a rush to get somewhere. No one's really looking at you.
Yeah. I've often said that like if you want to imagine the experience of growing up in New York, imagine like you have this route that you go to work every day. It's the same road, the same bus stop, the same train stop. And one day you decide to take one road to the right or one road to the left. You will find that like you've gotten used to the people that you're around on that commute. And just by stepping one block differently, you discover that there's a whole other city one block away from you. The New York City is many cities in threads that go parallel and rarely mix, and you can go your whole life without knowing about certain corners. It's wild. Ever since I kind of realized that, like this is like way back when I was a kid, in like the late '90s, basically. I've always been someone who enjoys taking the one step to the right or one step to the left and seeing what new worlds I might fall into, and like I'll fall into a random West African restaurant and be like, damn, I never even heard of this random spice. It's killing my mouth right now, but I'm glad I took that step to the left. Or like I'll take a step to the right and like find a Norwegian fishery that I've never even heard of existing. And like, dang, this came all the way from the Baltic Sea. It's damn good.
Yeah, but you're actually describing like one of my literal experiences in New York City.
Yeah.
Like I was gonna go see. This was still when I was still in the cocktail bar game, and I was living this, late night, brooding in a corner of a bar writing poetry, and like I'm supposed to be at sparring practice in 4 hours, and I finally, eat the $24 Uber back to Brooklyn. But on my way there, I'm taking the L train to from Williamsburg to to the East Village / Alphabet City, and I'm walking and I realize I'm hungry and I don't want Italian food, and I see a Nigerian restaurant. Like it's kind of uncanny, the exact description right now, and various like late night walks where I'm like, I'm gonna go through West Village and Tribeca, and I'm gonna go all the way down to the Red Dead Rabbit on Water Street. And I've just gone through like 3 lifetimes, and my friends back in California just truly do not understand.
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot. Like there's over 200 and something countries in the world, which basically means it's impossible to spend a year in every country. You can't live long enough to spend a full year in every country. And the best thing about living in New York is you really do get to see the world in like everywhere. This is why, like, despite everything that the shit that the city gets, I'm never gonna move from this place. If I do, it'll be a summer house. I'm primarily gonna stay in New York probably for the rest of my life. Because I like hearing stories. I like exploring new worlds, and I'm like the fucking Star Trek character. But like, yeah, I mean, like you've done it to yourself, where like like today I'm going to discover new things about a random part of the world, and I'll never be able to visit and probably never see, but people from there live here. I'm going to see it. Now saying that, I don't want the entire country to be like that. I'm okay with the cities being that way, but the countryside, like that's Angloland. Let them be. Like living here also, like you do get the sense that like the urban elite do really hate the people out of the city. And it's just like, well, why put the effort into hating these people you'll never agree with and you'll probably never even meet? Like, why do you want to destroy them? And I've gotten interesting conversations with progressives about this, because like if you approach them from like the hatchling, the famous hatchling approach, where like you pretend not to know anything, you can get them to be a little self-reflective about how hateful they are. But like, yeah,
if you go head on, they'll hit you in the face with a crowbar. But if you bait them into a mirror, then it all comes crashing down from them.
Yeah, and I've started saying it to people where like I think the troll culture has to die, or you are going to get your civil war. Like you kind of have to like be a little bit more reflective and patient with these people who are, no matter how full of it is, they feel like they're under assault from like they feel like they're getting stricken by just because someone isn't like them, and they're not smart enough to understand that the world actually is diverse and doesn't actually agree with them. But they're smart enough to look at a reflection if you can convince them to look at it.
Oh, without a doubt. I joke with a lot of friends of mine on Instagram, because some of them follow my personal Instagram account, and I'm from Oakland, San Francisco, which is, it's ground zero for anti-culture, and it's probably the most left-wing place in the world. Maybe Portland, but I've been to Seattle, it doesn't even come close. New York doesn't even come close in terms of how left-wing Oakland is in particular.
Yeah, but Oakland isn't diverse, right? It's just like
actually Oakland is a quarter black, a quarter Hispanic, a quarter Asian, a quarter white. It's interesting, but you think it's a completely black town by the culture.
Yeah. Well, it has a culture to it that isn't as diverse as the people.
yeah. Well said. But yeah, like they'll follow me on my private personal Instagram, and they'll see I'm like dropping red pills, and like, why are you talking about these talking points from 2020? I'm like, to my friends back home, this is all completely new to them.
Yeah.
And I posted like a little Rishi Sunak bit, that was all the rage back in the fall. And he's like, I think you old teammate of mine on the fight team I was on in San Francisco. He's like, I think you misunderstand. These people are British citizens. And I'm like, he's Haitian ethnically. And I said, so you're telling me like I could become a Haitian citizen and then dictate policy for there to be no Haitians in the governing body? And he's just like, well, no. I'm like, well, might want to think on that.
Well, yes, that's a good point, because what if the positions were reversed does work on non-white people. But for white people, they just don't give a shit.
No,
white progressives, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even Malcolm X has gone off on white liberals, which is somewhat of a talking point in this corner of the world. Like you see like some odd creators who aren't so vocal. It's like, yeah, actually, Malcolm X pretty big fan. But if you kind of say that out loud, people are like, what? What are you saying?
Yeah, because because there is a certain cult of the black man in America that both the right and left wing suffer from. The second a black guy sounds conservative, the right wing wants to like be their slaves to him, and or the second he's like, the second he wants to be a leader, the progressives will give them their virgins immediately.
Yeah, it's very odd. It's very like erratic behavior from both sides of the aisle.
I call it spiritual fidgeting. There's like this like fidget that you can tell like they'll say the most racist man alive will want to like be a gay lover to a base black man. It's a spiritual fidgeting that like a lot. I don't know what's going on, but like there's a fidgeting in there that the second something that agrees with them that is their enemy shows up, they're like, we are blood brothers now. We will go to war together.
I mean, everyone's itching for like a very straightforward war these days because there are none.
Yeah.
NGOs took the glory out of war. Everything's quasi. Everything is like, wait, why are we here again? And friends of mine who are in special forces have echoed the same sentiments. It's like, oh, okay, so you're telling me I didn't sign the dotted line for good reason. He's like, oh yeah, you save yourself some time. I'm like, great. It's still depressing, but I'm glad I didn't waste my time and possibly get injected with some things that will ruin my test down the line.
I'm just coming out of a PhD program I quit because I really didn't want to deal with a lot of the nonsense that was going on in academia these days, and I'm not even entirely convinced there will be many schools to work for when I would be done. But I'm glad I went. Like, it was 6 months in Europe that was very enjoyable, but I also and like I didn't have to pay for it either. But like I was like, dang, if I stay here, I'm gonna be like 35, single, and have to work in Europe until I'm 40. Probably stay single. This is an IQ shutter. I'm getting the hell out.
Yeah, I mean, it's like so many opportunities are like a trap, and it leaves it kind of, for the most part, it segregates people into two, classes. People who, don't really commit to anything because they're so terrified of getting thrown in the IQ shredder, and guys who just went face first into it and hope for the best. There are very few who are like kind of picking their shots accordingly, where it's like, all right, this is going to be worth for 2 years, and I'm going to get out, and I'm going to, chart a course this way, hopefully, God willing. I was telling Jay Burden that, like, I left Silicon Valley. I was like, I know I'm gonna like be fucking miserable. I'm good at this. I signed some high profile clients, but get me the hell out of here. Like, I just couldn't do it, and I worked in bars instead to be a fighter, which is hilarious. But yeah, so I mean, basically, I think at this point, for the 5 people who are listening, but this will go to the Spotify audio only podcast, where most of my audience listens to me and whatnot. They're getting the gist that you're not the same dissident right talking point guy, either coming from like academia or coming from the same 5 talking points, or in our both of our cases, this kind of I got to get out of the city. I got to homestead. And if I don't, it's just not going to be okay. It's so over. Why would I ever want to be in a city? I mean, it's all very soft, if I'm being honest. And I think it's a bit ridiculous.
Well, it is fundamentally like this. If you've read Tolkien, all of his main characters come from like the Shire, and all of them have to go through this process of like being like de-domesticated, if you will. Like they have to like get their feet wet and like get out of the Shire and realize that the world isn't the Shire, and the Shire very well may burn down.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, one of my biggest problems with the movies is that it doesn't show the scouring of the Shire at the end of the books. If you're familiar with it, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because like that is Tolkien robbing these heroes of a good ending. Like, they can't go back again, and now like they always knew they couldn't go back mentally, but now they actually can't go back to the Shire from before when they left. It's been burned down. They actually have to put the work in to rebuild it, and to make it something new. The hobbits ultimately do get wiped out, and they ultimately do have to like rebuild their civilization from the ashes. They couldn't, and had the heroes stayed in the Shire, they probably would have died with everyone else. They probably would never had been anybody. And so by going out into the world and getting a little bit toughened up and learning its wisdom and denying where it isn't wise, they went back and could ultimately be heroes to the Shire as well as the world. Because in the movie, when they come back without the scouring of the Shire in the movies, they come back and everyone acts like nothing's ever changed, and these are just these weird adventurers that who knows what they did. They're still farmers back in the Shire. It's actually kind of tragic, right? They come back from that adventure and they're just farmers again rather than heroes. But in the books, they come back as heroes and prove their worth by saving the Shire from war. I like the book so much more because of that, and in many ways, there's this like need to run away to the Shire, the countryside. I mean, it's good to do that when you're an old man, have family, and have done your part to build civilizations. It's not very great to do that when you're young. Like, in ancient times, you weren't even in the Roman Republic and Empire. You weren't allowed to do that. You had to serve in the legionaries for 20 years before you had your 40 acres and a mule. You didn't start from that.
Yeah, it's a decay of the male spirit in general. Like, we're not built just like, all right, I got my land, I'm just gonna sit here forever. You see 20-year-olds acting like that. I'm like, no, you're not 45, like coming
Yeah.
coming off of like multiple tours in Iraq and then building a successful business and having some kids. Like you're just disenfranchised with the fact that you've been in COVID lockdown and now you're freaked out that you're going to be tossed into a bug pod, so you're trying to get out, and it's just. And what do you think is going to happen? And the thing is, I tell this to people all the time who try to push that towards me, like, dude, you got to get out to Idaho, and I'm like, no, like I'm not coming to Idaho, and they're like, why? I'm like, there's no elite level. I mean, my ambitions are in fighting and in business. And like, there's no elite level like Muay Thai fighting in fucking Idaho. And it's just like, you can make a gym. And I was like, okay, well, I'm in my 20s, man. Like, I'm not in my 40s.
Yeah, you can make a gym when you have a reputation that people want to go to.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, oh, Muay Thai in the middle of Coeur d'Alene. Like, I don't think so.
Like, don't get me wrong. If you're in those hinterlands, like, serve your people. But like, if you want to start something new, you have to get out of the Shire first and earn your worth, and then you can come back as a hero and build something like in your older years.
Absolutely. And I think so. There's a friend of mine who I'm going to actually have on this podcast post Lent. He has a startup of blockchain based land ownership, which is very interesting. And I was like, so is this going to be like out in the middle of nowhere? He's like, no, I'm not having any of these, patches of houses and ranches, anything with a journey longer than an hour and a half from cities, because we have to interact with cities because cities drive culture, whether we like it or not. Historically, this is the case.
There's something to think about that, actually, because most American cities were established, if I remember correctly from my jolly old urban studies classes, most American cities were established 3 days out from the nearest town beyond that. So like most towns and cities in America are like separated by a 3-day carriage journey. We actually haven't really developed an infrastructure for what it means to live in like a technological era with like flight and train. The trains have been here longer and have a little bit more an influence on how cities developed after that initial establishment. But we haven't really thought about like how does the speed of technology affect like centers and peripherals, because those things are all still infrastructure-wise built off of the assumption of a horse carriage that isn't used anymore.
Yeah, I mean, and then you have like various autistic arguments for high speed rail, like that's been a thing lately on the right, like high speed rail. Like car, society without cars is based. But then, like, you actually run the numbers on high speed rail and such in this country, and it's nonsensical. So.
Yeah, the high speed rail is for elites; it's not for common people.
Or
if it's a local rail, it's for like middle managers getting from the suburbs. It's not for you, based 20-year-old adventurers that want to like go into the countryside.
Yeah, it's. I don't think that people realize that this doesn't have the same energy as a community garden. There's a hell of a lot more overhead. That needs to be dealt with. But
sorry, I had a random thought that you hit, because one of the things I noticed in Belgium, Belgium, a train, like an hour train, gets you from Paris to Brussels.
Right.
But one of the things you notice when you ride a train in Europe, if you have, like, dang, those rails are. You're going 200 miles per hour, and the whooshing by railroad doesn't look like it's moved an inch. But in America, like a train half that speed, the trains are wibbly wobbling all over the place as you drive by. It's like such a shitty construction. It's like it's not meant to be high speed.
Yeah, I mean, we took a swift right turn away from railroads once Henry Ford had to say. We haven't really looked back, and I foresee us. I know you're an architect, and this is a conversation that I have a lot with a lot of my friends. My girlfriend, in fact, who was actually planning on being an architect once upon a time. Now she's a trad wife in training. But the turning suburban communities into like old agrarian style villages is very doable. What isn't doable is like making every city in America super walkable. Not every city is going to be New York or San Francisco. Which is fine. I mean, like, you're not going to make Houston as this urban, this sprawling, walkable thing.
People also don't realize the infrastructure has to get built for a massive city like New York or Chicago. Like the global trade network infrastructure and communications, like, because you're trading at like microseconds like pennies a microsecond. Chicago and New York are okay a distance because you have like a few seconds, microseconds, light speed difference for trade algorithms. But there's a reason why there's a European trade that's not part of the New York Stock Exchange. It's because it's too damn slow to do anything practical at the rapid trade level. So you just have to make a new market. So like this is what I mean. Like the speed, the distance between major metropolitan cities is somewhat predetermined by like their infrastructure, their technology, and their network. It's like New York is like the financial capital of the East Coast because it's of these factors. Whereas Chicago is the same thing in the middle of the country because of the same factors. It's difficult to run serious like peer-to-peer internet from there to there cheaply and privately for like specific like corporations and trading companies want like privatized Ethernet wire, fiber optic wires between each other for like secure and rapid communication and trade, and you just can't do that across the Appalachian Mountains very well.
No, absolutely not. But yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing, the main reason I wanted to have you on, I mean, I had you on my list for a little bit now after it's a very diverse portfolio you have of your work. Like it's a lot of history autisms in root, but the topics vary greatly. And as we could just kind of generalize like what it is that you're doing content wise, but the main thing I want to discuss is your article on Judeo-Christian values and how that's a bit of that term is a bit of a myth. It's a bit of a Nietzsche fabrication.
Yeah.
How Norse pagans their religion doesn't really come from Northwest Europe, as they say and claim, with various fight shorts with a Thor's hammer on it and whatnot. I've seen many people in fighting gyms like that. But I guess first to get where I'd want to start is what faith do you profess, and how did that possess you to basically go down this path of writing this article?
Oh, well, I was born and raised Catholic. Briefly tried out Lutheranism like a decade ago. Lutheranism is close to my heart because there is a lot of overlap with Catholicism, but that adventure also kind of convinced me that I'd rather try to fix Catholicism than be a schismatic. I do have a lot of respect for Orthodoxy too. Like I really do respect a lot of those older churches that have been through thick and thin in the fire.
Oh, sounds like we lost you.
Test.
We're so bad. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I didn't notice it cut off. I could hear you saying we can't hear you. But like I do believe I'm currently witnessing the death of Protestantism, which is something I do think it's something to weep about. But many of these philosophies have echoes in previous movements, and they kind of die at the same 500-year mark, just about. People should do more research into the longevity of Arius's heresy and how that spread like wildfire, but it couldn't really stick. It spread, but it didn't stick, and then after 500 years, it was gone. But yeah, I do think that the traditions and goals of the Protestants were noble and desirable, but their offspring don't seem to have inherited that will. Like for example, are you aware? This I love opening with this question, but are you aware that North Korea is the first Presbyterian country?
I cannot say that I am.
Yeah, the founder Kim Il Sung, his father was a Presbyterian missionary trained in Scotland, or trained with Scottish missionaries, and his mother too. They were very rich on Presbyterian theology. So when Kim Il Sung wrote Juche and many of the political diatribes of North Korea, it's actually infused with like Scottish Presbyterian theology and philosophy. Like the terms, the assumption and worldview come from a Presbyterian worldview. So the natural end of Presbyterianism, of like radical Presbyterianism and Calvinism, is in fact North Korea. That's what you will end up with. It's kind of amusing, but yeah, look up the family lineages of look up the missionaries and their offspring. You'll oftentimes find some very fascinating histories and narratives of how different people came in and went. Like there's there's this other Scottish Presbyterian guy who inhabited the Caribbean, and his children went on to like live in like British India and Jamaica and all kinds of random parts of the empire, and they all kind of like became really like bloody geniuses in their field. Like it's clearly there was an inheritance of intelligence, but within like 3 or 4 generations, they were all like godless Darwinists and like just as intelligent but godless because they didn't have the, I guess, the apostolic faith. They had a notion of Christianity, but they didn't have the apostolic inheritance. The faith once deposited to you. So anyway, that's the background of where I was coming from, and I grew up in, I mentioned I grew up in a diverse area in Manhattan. These things included a number of people from the Middle East and European countries that gave me a certain broader perspective of Christianity. So I was kind of aware that a lot of the pagan assumptions of Christianity weren't really historical. I didn't know where they came from, and I kind of wanted to figure out. And I think I found that they mostly come from Nietzsche. There may be someone I didn't find, but even Nietzsche's one of Nietzsche's early books, the Der Antichrist. This seems to be derived from a French Catholic text called L'Antichristi. Something, I can't speak French, but I can read it. And that book was basically trying to justify the French Revolution from a Catholic perspective, and this appears to have pissed Nietzsche off because he was aware this is bullshit. To his credit, Nietzsche was very aware of Nietzsche had a great bullshit sensor, but he didn't have a great like response to it.
He also didn't have a very good bullshit sensor with himself. Right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was going insane, but one of the best. Before I wrote this article, I was kind of researching like the pagan perspectives of Nietzsche to try and make that connection, and in that journey, I kind of came across John Michael Greer, who I think I've heard of him in the past, but he developed the concept of catabolic collapse. He's a pagan, and his biggest criticism of Nietzsche was basically that like the Übermensch can be understood as a god of progress, and there's an assumption that progress never ends, like God never ends. But if progress does end, if there's a end to progress, like if we find out, hey, there's really not much more to learn from the scientific or sociological world, then that God can no longer deliver its name. It can no longer progress. It's ended. It too will die. And so John Michael Greer had this quote that I found, come to God's grave and you'll find the grave diggers burying progress there, which is like a great line. I've rephrased it as, come to the grave Nietzsche dug for God and you'll find progress buried there. I prefer my rephrasing of his quote because it's a little bit more direct, but in my searching for the pagan origins for Christian perspectives, I did find that there are some pagans that take issue with Nietzscheanism and his perspective. But I would argue now that most of pagan theology does appear to be derived from some weird mix of Nietzschean and Baptist theology. Baptist in the sense of individuality, individual choice, free will, and stuff like that. If you actually read a lot of the ancient classics and pagans, they're not really aligned with neo-pagan thought. And if you press them on the issue, you'll find that a lot of times pagans will admit that, like, yeah, they take the name and idea of the ideals of the gods, but they don't really take much light on the stories of the gods. To which end, I then have to ask, like, well, I mean, is your god just a name skin suit from your language onto a fundamental force that can be found anywhere? You've kind of argued your way out of an ethnic god. Like a lot of these people they don't like the idea of a foreign god like Jesus from the Middle East, but like, I mean, you're basically doing the same thing in the sense of like taking this fundamental force that can be found anywhere in the universe, and just giving it like an Anglo-Saxon or Germanic name. Like, you're not really finding a god native to your people. You're finding a fundamental force of the universe and giving it a name. Or sometimes you'll have like I found, like in my article, I kind of did a history autism into the origin of Thor and found that it's probably a Middle Eastern deity too. Although I'll always add the prefix: the people that were worshiping Thor in the Middle East were also Indo-European. I will not insult the Indo-Europeans, the neo-pagans, by saying it's entirely foreign. It was just the Indo-Europeans that worship Thor in the Middle East were Indo-European. Anyway, that's a bit of a rant there. Sorry for going on a little bit of a long tangent.
Oh no, fair play. Yeah, I came across like a really interesting piece of information. Actually, I think no, I was I was on the Bagby stream with you at the tail end there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I came across a Hitler quote. Sorry, a mustache man, a mid-century German. I know that's the the safe lingo to call it, but basically stating that the Kurds and the Berbers were like the lost Aryans, like lost Germans, which kind of has some kind of alignment with what you're just stating. But yeah, I mean, even if you read the Prozetta, I performed a bunch of excerpts in the Prozetta as my first movement assessment project in drama school back in England, and the Prozetta makes it pretty clear that their origins come from Troy. Like the claim is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
these are the Trojans who fled Asia Minor after the successful Greek invasion. So even in that, so it's a lot of these neo-pagans. They kind of they will compare their fjords and mountains and meadows, like this is our ancestral land and this is where our faith has come from, and we reject the Jewish Christ from the desert. And before we get into those points in particular, because those are like two of, I'd say, probably the three main points you're making in this article you wrote in Substack that I'll keep in the show notes. But what possessed you to write this article? What kind of what about the term Judeo-Christian just didn't sit right with you and have you go down this rabbit hole and express this?
Yeah, I mean, I will credit the Lutherans for really 10 years ago, the LCMS was a very good champion against this. Nowadays, it's kind of cringe. The church has become very cringe, but there were a lot of writers questioning this term. I'll say like Pirate Christian Radio was a big one that reported about this a lot. These are things like 10 years ago. Most of these pseudo boomers have gradually denounced their own earlier works, but the work they're writing against Judeo-Christianity and the idea of a Judeo-Christian value were pretty good. A lot of them kind of come to the same conclusion that the term Judeo-Christian originates from the 19th century, where there was a move there was a move in the Jewish world to have a Zionism movement, and it seems that a lot of them realized they could never accomplish this without the Christian empires allowing it. So there was a move amongst many Zionist scholars to like befriend different empires and try to like finagle out the land of Palestine to reborn Israel. And then this is what happened. The Zionists picked and choose their forces. They eventually realized the British were going to be the best bet, and so they got the British promise for an Israel state after World War II. In between 1945 and like the late 1800s, this is basically the development of Zionism from what was originally Jews and Christians did not go along. I think anybody even remotely aware of medieval history is aware of things like the Inquisition. There was no bedfellows between the two religions. They did not like each other. They did not consider each other the same religion. And if you read enough of them, may have doubted there was even a common origin. There are significant reasons to question if the Judaism that is around today is the same Judaism that Jesus Christ was a part of. There's some evidence that says that it was probably a medieval reinvention by Christians returning to Judaism, not actually originating from Judaism itself. And there were insults for these people, and they called them Judeo-Christians. They were Christians attempting to go back to Judaism. And over time, with the Zionists in the 1800s, this term was flipped on its head to mean, the common values between Judaism and Christianity. What values exactly, I don't know. Like, it's not like we both have the 10 Commandments, but it's not like we both follow it the same way anyway. But I guess what possessed me was this, like, as neo-paganism has been growing in America. I'm actually quite convinced neo-paganism, not atheism, will be the next big religious movement in America. I'm pretty convinced of that. But I wanted to like put my 2 cents out there to like try and counter it before it grew. I do feel like in the next 40 years, you're going to see a rapid growth of paganism because it offers more than atheism, and it doesn't have the baggage of Christianity in the modern era. So like it's just the natural choice of what would grow in that void. And I kind of want to put my 2 cents into that void before it, off the hope that maybe it might convince some people to reevaluate their worldview. Maybe what they were taught by people is not so true.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of in terms of Judaism versus the Judaism now versus the Judaism then, the one thing where I think they may have a leg to stand on in this point of like quote unquote Judeo-Christian values is that Christianity is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, it's the fulfillment of Isaiah, the fulfillment of Elijah, so on and so forth. So the liturgical tradition that you and I share pretty closely, being Catholic and Orthodox, obviously with some variants, that originally comes from Judaism. That part is true. But what creates the Judaism we see today, Talmudic, rabbinic Judaism, is the rejection of Christ, like a rejection of Christ fulfilling every single one of these
these prophecies and
Messiah.
And we can be a little bit more specific. Like before the show, I was mentioning I'm reading Virgil, the poet of Rome, because he had read Isaiah and a few Magi writings. I'm fairly convinced Virgil was aware of the prophecy of Christ, and he seems to have wrote about it in his I think it's the fourth Eclogue. Let me make sure I'm reading it right. Virgil, Eclogue 4, in which he describes the Christ child from the Roman perspective, like years before Jesus was born, because he had read Isaiah, he had fallen in love with Isaiah's prophecies, and he believed that this child to be born would be also the child that would bring peace to the Roman Empire, because at that time it was in the midst of many civil wars. There will be some people that try to argue he's talking about Augustus, but he wrote it before Augustus took power. When he wrote, Augustus was just the youngest member of the triumvirate, and even Augustus didn't really seem to have related to himself. There's some people that will then speculate that the Christ child was going to be one of the heirs of Augustus, but it became very apparent that folks like Nero and other progeny of that lineage were nothing of the sort of that comparison. I think Nero famously might have thought himself to be what the poet was writing. I skipped ahead. In those time periods, in the classical Western world, poets were also prophets. Many of the poets of the Republican Empire era, they wrote prophecies based off of the traditions that they were familiar with. And some of their prophecies, they do speak of a Christ child. They do speak of a promised child from the East that would come and save them. I believe the terms that Virgil used was something along the lines of like, once more, like another war, another Troy, another Achilles will come, like a repeating of history almost. These like heroic figures from the East. I'm also aware, because I mentioned like I grew up around a few people from the Middle East, and one of them was Syrian, and he spoke Aramaic, and he was from a Chaldean background, and the Chaldeans were the nation that birthed the Magi. The Magi are famously pagan. They are pagan. They were pagan priests that show up at the birth of Christ, and there's always this question in the Christian world: where did these pagan priests come from? How do they know about Jesus, and why were they there? Like, what are these pagans doing at the birth of Christ? If you read your Bible, Daniel, the prophet and dreamer, was put in charge of the Magi during the Babylonian and Persian empires. He was explicitly put in charge of the wise men of their nation, and he seems to have. If you read Daniel a certain way, he does get the year of Christ's arrival to the year, and so the logic is, well, if Daniel's predicting Christ in the Old Testament to the year, and the Magi show up, he probably told the Magi this prophecy. If you do a little bit more deep diving, you can find in the star charts of that era. This is like a wild autism. I'll eventually write something on Substack about this if I haven't already. But you can find that there's a prophecy that does come true. It comes true somewhere in like the year, somewhere between 4 BC and 2 AD. I forget when it happened. When Jesus was born, the planet Jupiter enters retrograde in Virgo and stays in Virgo for 9 months and is witnessed by Venus, Saturn, and Mars and other planets. And if you understand what these symbols mean, Jupiter being in Virgo for 9 months means the king born of a virgin. Like the king is in the womb for 9 months and is born. Jupiter is the king. Then it heads to either Libra, or I forget what the signs are for the scales of judgment. But on the way to the scales of judgment, like the king born of a virgin will be judged, and he heads by serpent, so he's slaying the serpent. It's the proto-evangelium written in the heavens. And this star sign, the king Jupiter is witnessed by Mars, which is typically associated with the archangel Michael and Mercury, who is, I think, the archangel Gabriel, I can't remember, and Saturn is typically Satan. The name is actually derived from it. You may be familiar within the classical mythology. Saturn is famously in rings and chains, as it literally is as a planet. It's wild. I can tell you possibly some reasons why the Romans might have known that Saturn had rings, but that's for another time. And so the birth of Christ is witnessed by the archangels of heaven, like Michael, Gabriel, Satan, and the others, the main planets. And so this prophecy in the heavens, which is known to by most astrological cultures, would have been known by the Magi, and them knowing this sign would have brought them to the Christ child when it was born. Likewise, Virgil, writing prophecies and poems relating the stars divine, predicting this Christ child, from a pagan Roman perspective. Again, he's not a Jew. He's out in Rome writing from copies of Isaiah he's found from the recent conquests in Palestine and Alexandria. He would have known when Christ would have been born through the Magi stories, because Virgil studied astrology and the Magi when he was young. This is written. Fun fact, in his prophecies in the fourth eclogue, he laments the years needed to see the birth of this child, and he knows he's not going to live long enough to see it. He laments being born like a few years off from living to see that Christ child born. And he's writing this 30 years before Jesus is born. And long story short, this does indicate that the first followers, or anticipation, like those anticipating the Christ child, they weren't even Jews. They were Romans. They were Greeks. They were Alexandrians. These are people that study the stars and signs passed down through generations. So the first people to come to Christ and bow to him were pagans. They were foreigners. They weren't Jews. The first Christians weren't Jews. Even if you want to say Jesus was the first Christian or the last Jew, depending on who you ask, it's kind of tragic the way pagans hate Christ now, because, hey, your ancestors were the first ones to acknowledge him, not the Jews. So how can you call it a Jewish religion if the first people that followed him were these pagans from Persia and Rome? It's wild to me. Sorry, that was a long rant, but those are some things to think about.
No, certainly. I think, and a lot of people who, I've bumped into various Kabbalists who talk about, well, Jesus was a Jew, and then they say the first Christian. Well, I mean, if you profess a Christian faith, you consider him the Son of God. That probably takes precedent above all the rest. But I mean, there's a comment in the live chat saying weren't the wise men Zoroastrian. I think at least one of them was, but I don't think they were Zoroastrian.
I have a wild theory that I really don't bring up often, that Daniel was Zoroaster, because his Babylonian name is Belteshazzar, and that's close enough to Zoroaster that I'd argue it might be it. Zoroaster's name, his full name was Ashtar Zoroaster, I think. I forget Ahura Mazda, is that the name of the Zoroastrian god?
Correct. Yeah.
I think Zoroaster's name was something like Ahura Zoroaster, and so if you interpret the Zoroaster part of his name as like the people back then had multiple names because different people knew them by different tongues. So Ahura would be the god dedicated that the name is dedicated to, and then Zoroaster would be the descriptor of how he's honoring that god. Then Ahura Zoroaster is equivalent to Belteshazzar, I think. It's something like there's a TH in there somewhere, I think. I forget. It's not quite the same. There's no Z. But Beltu is a god. Ashur is a god. And you could argue that it's basically the same name honoring the same god under a different language. So my big conspiracy theory is that Daniel and Zoroaster are the same person, and Zoroastrianism is just a corruption of Daniel's prophecies. Daniel famously refused to go back to Israel. He may very well have been one of the first Essenes because he rejected Israel. He chose to stay in the Middle East and serve the kings of Persia for the rest of his life. Even when the temple was getting rebuilt and the Jews were returning to Palestine, he no longer considered himself a member of that society. He chose to stay in Persia and Babylon and to be to teach the priests of Zoroaster, basically. And if you go digger in this rabbit hole, in the West, there's this assumption that Zoroaster comes from like 1500 BC or something. And if you look into that, that's kind of made up nonsense from like 19th century pseudoscience. The Iranians themselves say that Zoroaster was born sometime in the 500s BC. and lived in that era. And if you look in the archaeological record, there's no evidence of Zoroaster before the 500s BC. There is one single piece of art dedicated to Ahura Mazda from like 1500 BC, but there's no mention of Zoroaster, and there's plenty of instances where a god is known about before the prophet that makes him more publicly known. So I don't really interpret the single image. I don't even know if there's a name to it, but the iconography looks like a Harazara on like a rock wall from like 1500 BC. That's scant evidence. You're not mentioning Zoroaster. I don't know if you're even mentioning the name of the god. It's just assumed because the iconography is similar. It seems that Zoroaster probably lived in the 500s BC, which is the same era that Daniel lived. And so if you read when Daniel's made in charge of the wise men of Babylon, wise men being Magi, well, you can't have two high priests. Either Zoroaster and Daniel are sharing the position of high priest, or they are in fact the same person.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, so to button some things up before we kind of carry on.
Sorry, I go on long rants. You got to cut me off.
Oh no, I mean, I don't really mind that. You know, there's a famous line in this, like, you know, in this podcast. People always apologize for being long-winded. I'm like, no, that's fine. Like, I actually prefer it that way. And I have enough of a attention span that I can kind of like respond to each little bit. So, as far as your bits about you know, pagans being the first Christians, it does kind of add more light to the centurion, you know, coming to Christ in humility.
Yeah.
Because it struck me as more than just, you know, when reading that, it struck me as more than just hearing about the miracles of Christ. More so as a centurion to be a well-read person, especially in that area, especially if he's excavating, you know, helping.
Yeah. He's trusted. He's trusted. He's in the elite. He knows the governor.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it's in terms of a lot of people, you know, you see the fedora tipping person, like, you know, Schrodinger's cat. Yeah, have you ever heard of the cave, bro? Yeah, I actually heard you know, most of Christianity was taken from Plato. It's like, okay, man. But yeah, it kind of sheds more light upon a lot of Gentiles' response to the coming of Christ, and it does run parallel to all the prophecies and the Abrahamic tradition that Christ fulfilled. What's really curious to me, though, and I've only read, and this is also running in tandem with what a lot of people would call like the extra biblical books, right? The books that, you know, are of this era, but not necessarily added to biblical canon, sans the Ethiopian and Eritrean, you know, Orthodox churches.
Yeah.
So not even Eastern Orthodox, but Oriental Orthodox churches calling this canon. Like, you know, the most famous one's the Book of Enoch. But a lot of people ask the question, why does it matter? And it's not necessarily that it matters or not. It's more details and scope surrounding the story. A lot of friends of mine, particularly this guy called the Saxon Cross, he's pretty hell-bent on, you know, lining up stories of mythology with stories of the Bible. And he has a bunch of working theories that, you know, a lot of these people called Thor who were slaying demons are actually angels. So that's a bunch of theories in terms of, you know, mapping out the world, you know, to connect the dots with the biblical stories. It's not only is it fun, but I think it puts a lot of people who, you know, this maybe not won't have as much of an extreme view as like neo-paganism, but maybe they're wary of Christianity for the sake of cultural veneration. They're seeing, you know, the European heritage die. And they're seeing a lot of these myths and legends be called, you know, satanic by the evangelical traditions that are thankfully fading now.
And this is tragic because there's so much overlap between them. Like if you read the original writers of a lot of, like, you know, there are a lot of writers debating between pagans and Christians in the first and second and third centuries. Most famously Justin Martyr, who by far was the, like, the demons people kind of side of the argument. But there's also an argument that these are just half remembered stories of like the sons of Noah, which I much prefer this view because, I mean, for one, a lot of the names of these gods aligns with the names of Noah's sons, like that Des Petar, not Des Petar, Dios Petar is one letter short of Yapetar, like the son of Noah. So it's like, okay, so like through accent, because like languages changed every century in those years. Dies Petar isn't that far off from Yepetar, the son of Noah, and it's also not that far off from Ipetar, the Titan in Greek mythology. Furthermore, their children like Ion, famously the ancestor of the Ionians, that's spelt the same way as the Yavanites, the grandson of Noah. You could go down and down and down the list, and the more that linguists and archaeologists connect the dots in like the Indo-European pie migration, the more it starts to align with biblical claims of where the Noah's Ark was and where the Japhetic peoples migrated from. It's like it's not like these research lineages are disproving the Bible; they're actually proving them. Like, all these Northern European, all these like Indo-European people originate from the steppes by the Caucasian mountains. Hey, isn't that where Noah's Ark landed?
You might have heard of the African origin theory, my friend. Let me educate you. Nail paint emoji. But yeah, it's. I think the more work that's done to align these things, the healthier that European society and its extension, countries across overseas, will get in terms of their collective psyche and their embrace of Christianity as part of its tradition and canon, and not something separate. I may be somewhat misusing that, and I'm sure Paul Fahrenheit would hear it.
Paul Fahrenheit's one of the people that encouraged me to dive deeper into these topics because he was very interested in the origins and stories of like the Aryan people. I haven't made a linguistic link from the Aryans to the Japhetic people, but I'm starting to possibly uncover one. But like I do think that like throughout the 1st through 5th centuries, a lot of Christian poets wrote poems and mythologies and songs for the origin of their people that like bridged these gaps, because a lot of these people were in between cultures and knew multiple languages and could see how the words translated across borders. Our people nowadays, unfortunately, are more monolinguistic and less able to see that. So we kind of have to, part of building an aristocracy is being able to speak to like anyone in Europe or the Middle East and have like that knowledge basis in your head to speak to anyone. Like you should really know, like everybody in these circles should really know French, Spanish, Italian, like Arabic, Greek, and Latin. Like these are things that your grandfathers all knew. Like your great grandfathers all knew when they came here to colonize this land. They could speak all these languages because it was a standard in education, and that's kind of been lost now, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's just not seen as necessary because this is just we have an ocean in between us. We're an Anglo-founded country with a bunch of immigrants who are expected to adopt the quote unquote American culture, which is really just an extension offshoot of being an Anglo. So it's not really as necessary as in Europe, but even in Europe, it's dying down, probably because of the quote unquote gays' influence on.
Yeah, unfortunately, everybody just speaks English in Europe now. It's really sad.
Yeah, that's depressing. France will probably still be like, no, which is good. I think their shitty attitude is actually coming out on top in terms of preserving their linguistic tradition.
Well, France is an exception because to be French, you must know French. You can't be French and be illiterate about French. It's a rare exception, and I think we could learn a thing or two about like, well, you can't be American if you don't speak American or English, right? Politically speaking, France is kind of like our father, and England our mother, and to some degree, we've kind of cursed our father and embraced fully our mother, and it shows up in our matriarchal culture. I think if Americans could learn a lot by how French do.
Yeah, that's the opposite take that I've heard, because typically argue. I mean, in terms of literature, I've talked about how the French are, the English are not capable of French literature because they don't go through the sort of mental episodes throughout the day. Like these are feelings that most Anglos would just ignore. Like Anglos would be like, right, I don't know what that's about, so, and then just carry on. Like literally keep calm and carry on. Yeah. Whereas, a Parisian will go through an existential crisis 3 times a day. They've written about it. It's flourishing, and just Anglos are not capable of this. And I think something that's similar is Russia, in the sense, like no one has really been through that kind of anguish, so they couldn't give birth to something like Solzhenitsyn or Ivan Bunin or Dostoevsky and whatnot. But I think Yeah, you and I are both prone to tangents. But I think what's what's interesting at the work you did in this article is kind of cornering a lot of misunderstandings, misnomers, and just general deceptions um, that point towards Christianity and the origins of the West and how deep those roots go. Those aren't just things because a lot of people see these roots as just going back to the conversion of kings, the first really being Constantine,
Yeah.
and then various Slavic kings and whatnot. But and you've highlighted too with like the astrological background, and that does kind of tie in with the extra biblicals of the Book of Enoch because you see the way that it's worded. The Book of Enoch, the fallen angels don't teach the people of the earth lies. They teach them astrology, numerology, all these practices that humanity quote unquote wasn't ready for. That's the direction.
Yeah. Because there's a lot of interest. I love Enoch. I'm glad that at least one apostolic church has it as canon because it's like the Ethiopians love it too. But it really is quite a fascinating book. It just requires a certain level of biblical knowledge to understand.
Absolutely. Like if you go face first into the Book of Enoch, like a lot of people try, it gets a bit schizo in terms of like
Yeah, you end up with Black Israelite movement, really.
Yeah,
Not to go on another tangent, but because like Enoch does have a heavy basis of like the origin of races, and basically everyone in Enoch is dark until Noah, and Noah's the first white guy, and so a lot of Black Hebrew folk will interpret this as the that's where all the bad things happen, even though biblically speaking Noah is like one of the purest prophets out there. Yeah. Anyway, slight tangent.
yeah, no, fair play. In terms of, a couple of the eye openers that I'd love for you to elaborate further on is, I titled this episode "Old Covenants," not Old Covenant singular, but Old Covenants plural, because the big eye openers were the origins of the Christian tradition in the Essenes.
Yeah.
And that's actually something that my mother kind of pointed out to me once upon a time. So the two main things I wanted to discuss were that and the other agreements, the other covenants that were made with other people in the Middle East aside from the Hebrews, and how you came to this knowledge and how these puzzle pieces sort of came together for you.
I think the first clue that there are two clues in the Old Testament that God did not only deal with the Jews or only make covenants with the Jews. The first of these is when Abraham has his first kid Ishmael, before Sarah gets pregnant. The Hagar, the mother, she flees from the family, and God comes to her and makes a covenant. So one of the first covenants God makes isn't even with the line of Israel. It's with the line of Ishmael, and God promises Ishmael through Hagar, like it promises Hagar, like I'll make you. Don't worry about Abraham and Sarah. I'm gonna make your children a great nation. He doesn't say a plentiful nation like with the Jews. Like the Jews are plentiful. He says that the sons of Ishmael will be powerful, and they'll also be quite violent people. like they'll stick up for themselves, but it's also going to cause a lot of infighting. Famously, the people of Arabia trace their ancestry through Ishmael. So, like, pretty much everyone who's Arabic and speaks Arabic is considered like the son of Ishmael. And the Muslims will latch on this covenant, which they view as like justification for their actions. Now, mind you, at no point in this covenant does God promise them spiritual salvation. Like he does, this covenant is not one of promising them heaven. It's actually promising them worldly power. And who can deny the worldly power of the Muslim people? They have much worldly power. They bomb where they please. They build where they please. They do whatever they want. They war with each other. The prophecy, the covenant and prophecy which God gave to Hagar, as far as I'm concerned, has been proven by history. These are very warlike, infighting people, and they respect strength and honor. And if you give them that, they'll give you that. Anyway, though, like that's one of the first things that hinted to me that God was making more than just the covenant with Abraham. There's this covenant, which if you look into it in the Hebrew, it's fascinating because it's one of the rare places where God reveals his name. Later on, when he's talking to Moses, God admits he never revealed his name Yahweh, or as the Aramaic say Yahweh. I prefer that more Middle Eastern sounding way. God never reveals his name Yahweh to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. He never revealed his name Yahweh to them. Instead, he was known to them, he says, as El Shaddai, which means the God from. It literally means the God from Shaddai, which is a rural town in like Anatolia somewhere. So I mean, he's presenting himself to the Jews as a god further north with the Indo-Europeans, which is kind of interesting. There's another tangent there you could go on if you want. Like, God presents himself to the Jews as the gods of the northern Indo-Europeans. So God presents himself not as the god of the Jews at first, but as the gods of the northern people. And the reason for that is because the northern Indo-European people were originally the most faithful to him. In Genesis, the people that actually obey God's command to fill the earth and go out throughout the world are the sons of Japheth, specifically the lineage of Yavan. They actually go out and follow the orders, whereas everyone else kind of lies or cheats or builds the Tower of Babel and doesn't follow God's order. Anyway, that's another tangent. So God reveals himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the God of Shaddai, El Shaddai, a different like an alias basically. El is famously it's basically a pagan god in the Palestinian lineage. So God uses an alias to speak to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not Yahweh, not Yahweh, as he revealed himself to Moses. But in that, there's a bit of a reveal that God does use aliases. He has multiple names that he uses for different people, and he'll choose what name to reveal himself to depending on what he wants that people. So Moses is privileged to know the true name of God as Yahweh. And the only other person who knows that is Hagar, who's the name is revealed to her when God makes the covenant. Which these are two very interesting things. It means that God makes covenants with other peoples, not necessarily Jews. That God often presents himself as a foreign god anyway. Well, in the case of the Jews, he presents himself as the God of the Indo-European faithful up in Anatolia. Do a little exercise sometime to figure out where Shaddai is. It's further north up the Euphrates River. But it's kind of interesting that God chooses to identify himself as this foreign god to the Jews. So he doesn't even present himself as the God of the Jews. He presents himself as the God of Anatolia, from the town of Shaddai, which later on becomes associated with the God of peace because Shaddai was a peaceful town. Sorry, another long tangent, but this fact indicates that there's more than one covenant. And if you start digging deeper, you'll find that Noah, as the prophet and king after the flood, relays to his children promises and curses. So to Ham, he famously curses his son Canaan to be a slave. At first he says a slave to Shem, which is the ancestor of the Jews, and then later on a slave to Japheth, which is the ancestor of the Europeans. To the Europeans, he says, you'll get territory and dominion over your brothers as long as you go to the tents of Shem, which is an idiom. It's a way of saying to visit someone's tent is to bow to their tent gods. So like it's a greeting where you come to the tent of someone and you respect their gods at the front entrance. And so when God says, when Noah says to Japheth, so long as you visit the tents of Shem, you will have worldly dominion. In Genesis 9 or 10, I forget which because I'm sleepy and sick. This is basically a covenant that says as long as you go to church, you'll have world dominion. And I think history testifies to the fact that as long as Europeans have gone to church, they have ruled the world. And there's also inverses to these. So, the curse to Ham and his son Canaan, that you'll be slaves, there's an inverse to that. Obey your father, and you will have peace and live well and free. And likewise, the offspring of Ham, those are primarily the Africans and the Asians. They have a heavy emphasis on the fact that you have to obey your father or your civilization is going to collapse. And throughout both of these people's histories, whenever their sons have disobeyed their fathers, their societies have collapsed. Either the heavenly mandate in Asia or just the tribal patriarch in Africa. These cultures are prone to degenerate into tyrannical matriarchies whenever they violate Noah's order. History, again, testifies to this thing. Likewise, for the sons of Japheth, if they don't go to church, they are cursed to be destroy, like just dust, nothing. And likewise throughout history, whenever the Europeans have cursed God and gone away from Him, they've experienced devastations and destructions and the ruling of foreign peoples over them. And whenever they've come back in repentance, they've been given world dominion once again. There are specifics that people can bring up about what about this, what about that, exceptions about that. I'm talking about generalities throughout history. Essentially, once the Europeans embraced Christ, they were pretty much destined to rule the world. And now that they've walked away from Christ, they're pretty much destined to lose the world dominion. Whenever God gives a curse or a blessing, there's always an inverse to it. It's kind of like a coin flip. Where not coin flip, not. It's kind of like a obey this covenant, here are your blessings. Disobey this covenant, here are your curses. Pick or choose. So these covenants to the peoples of the world are generally called the covenant of Noah, which the rabbis talk about as like it's an easier covenant. You don't have to chop a part of your dick off. You just have to be faithful to the 7 laws of Noah, which you can look up on your own time. I'm too tired to look at it right now. But these 7 laws of Noah, basically, it kind of rhymes with the 10 Commandments. And the 7th law of Noah is establish governments to ensure these things are followed. And so that there is a covenant for mankind. You need to make government to establish order, or otherwise you're going to fall to the curses of these covenants. I mean, that's a long tangent, but these are several of the covenants and prophecies throughout the Old Testament that are completely independent of the Jewish people. They have nothing to do with the Jewish people. They are promises to Africans and Asians and Indo-Europeans.
That was actually where I wanted to go further. That's actually perfect. You mentioned Japheth and Shem. What about the third son? Was there in the Americas any? I'm curious. This is something I'm completely unfamiliar with.
I think it's Mormon belief. I mean, Noah probably had other sons, and if you need to think that something happened in America to feel comfortable, it's not really relevant. I'm not going to bother.
No, I'm just wondering.
Like, not you. Like whoever asked that. I mean, but as far as we can tell, Native Americans primarily come from Asia. There's a little bit of
Oh, he's lost again. Hopefully you can hear me again.
Admixture from there's a number of admixtures in the Native Americans that
and he's gone.
Test. Sorry, I got cut off.
Oh, no worries. I can hear you now.
Well, there are a number of admixtures in Native American cultures from like it's primarily Siberian. There's a little bit of Polynesian admixture, a little bit of Anatolian admixture, possibly a little bit of Celtic mixture. And if you read the Icelandic sagas, there's a little bit of Viking mixture in there too.
Yeah, that was my overall understanding. I was curious because I've met people who were not Mormon who have some claims of different peoples.
I have read a few books. There's this book by a Lutheran pastor in like the 1750s where he's documenting his arrival to the New World and exploring how Christianity is degenerating in the colonies. It's like one of the first black pill posts of America at 1750 before the country's even established. But he mentions coming to ruins in Pennsylvania where he found Hebrew inscriptions on a doorpost. And it seemed to be older than the colony. And he said that the colonists were using the stones of these buildings for their foundations, so the ruins weren't going to last. They were being mined for home foundations. And this is a common practice in the colonies, where it happened in South America too, where the Native American buildings are deconstructed and rebuilt as the foundation stones for colonial housing. So who knows? There may have been a crash ship of Jews in Pennsylvania at some point in history. It is interesting. It is documenting. A Lutheran pastor visited Pennsylvania in the 1750s, and he found the ruins of a Jewish house. It's and the interesting thing that the Jewish characters that he read. One of the reasons why I doubt this is because what is a German guy knowing Hebrew? Because Hebrew had been mostly extinct at this time in history. So there's a little bit of doubt in this history, in the sense of like who taught you Hebrew? It's an extinct language. But he says that the Hebrew said, "Thus far, the God of Joshua has saved us." And if you know your history, Joshua is the name of Jesus in Hebrew. So it's literally like a Judeo-Christian house he founds. But in the sense of like these were Jewish people that were calling on the name of the God of Joshua, which is Joshua is the other way you can Yeshua in Aramaic and Hebrew and Arabic. It translates to either Jesus or Joshua, depending on what you want. Yeah. Anyway, I'll get the name of the book if you want.
Please send that to me, because I've heard multiple arguments to such. I mean, there's been kind of the Tartarian conspiracy theory that
I love that one.
Circulated in 2020.
I love that. I love that one because I'm a dirty Slav and I like anything that adds to the mythology of those people.
Well, I mean, so not to go on a tangent of my own, I don't know about the free energy bits, although there's some interesting arguments for that as well. But there was a CIA document that was declassified in 1999 of a CIA document from 1957 documenting that Joseph Stalin ordered the destruction of all Tartarian buildings, written history, and whatnot in September of 1944 because it was antithetical with Soviet ideology. So that exists. So that part's real. I don't know, mud floods and free energy. I've seen a level of retardation basically saying the Eiffel Tower is like a free energy antenna.
And those are just fun. They're just fun. They're entertainment. I'll entertain that. I like to say, I always let 10% of my brain just allow the possibility that the Earth is flat, just for fun. Just
maybe. Yeah.
I put in the private chat the Pennsylvanian guy. His name was Gottlieb Mittelbergers. But you can read that on your own time. There's a couple different versions of it, but it's a really nice little like this Lutheran German guy touring the American colonies of Pennsylvania and documenting the good and the bad. But anyway, next topic.
The other bit I want to talk about was like the origin. So you talked a lot about the origins of Christianity coming more from the traditions of the Essenes, as opposed to Jerusalem, the high church or the high temple.
Yeah, I make the argument that a lot of the Old Testament, there's this like people have said I shouldn't call it two different religions, but there are two different perspectives in the Israelite region. One of these perspectives is what became Judaism, and it was followed by the tribe of Judah, and it was believed by the temple officials and the urban priests. So it was a very urban religion. That it was primarily divided between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These are the two main antagonists of Jesus Christ in the Gospels. The Sadducees were Hellenists that wanted to integrate Yahweh into the Greek pantheon somehow, like maybe make him Jupiter or something. The Pharisees were more interested in continuing the more Babylonian, Persian influenced form of Judaism, because by the time of Jesus, the Judaism of the Old Testament had already gone extinct. They had adopted a new alphabet. Their language had been shifted from Persian and Babylonian rule. There was not a whole lot of cultural continuation from the Old Testament other than like the cultural practices, and that's about it. The language had changed. The alphabet had changed. They no longer wrote with the same letters. The Hebrew you know of today, the box script, that's derived from Babylonian. The original Hebrew was more similar to the Phoenician alphabet, which later on became Latin. So the older Old Testament Hebrews wrote more like the Latins and the Greeks. So this was basically like the urban religion of what we now call Judaism. Outside of the urban areas, there were a few other perspectives. There were the Zealots, who were a hodgepodge of Jews and other tribes that wanted to oppose the Romans and Greeks. They were interested in independence, and these formed violent revolutions that killed tens of thousands of Romans. At one point, I think the Kito revolt. Look up the Kito revolt when you can. I think Kito revolt, Kito. That was one of the most brutal revolts by the Zealots in history. I think like 200,000 Romans died or something. They genocided civilians like you can't believe. It was a violent event in history.
Yeah, you mentioned it was like this form of highly effective Jewish terrorism when you're.
It was highly effective terrorism. They would just burn down whole Roman colonies and slaughter everyone. It was really bad. And this is actually the Zealots were the group that eventually led Rome to say, you know what, fuck it, just nuke it all, nuke it from orbit, like blow up Jerusalem a second time. One wasn't enough. And then the final sect that's known about, there are probably others that are not so well known about. You could argue the Samaritans were another sect, because the Samaritans were an Aramaic speaking Syrian Empire influenced group of the 10 tribes of Israel, not Judah, not the Jews. They were the other tribes of Israel. They were a mix of Indo-Europeans, Africans, and Asiatics that were conquered by the Syrian Empire, and they became Samaria. Samaria is the rump state of what was once Israel. You might remember from the Bible, the country of Israel split into two between Judah, which became the Jews, and Israel, which became the Israelites. They're two distinct people. They're not the same. Israelites became Samaritans after significant cultural colonization from the Syrians. And the Samaritans still live to this day. They still speak Aramaic, a Syriac language. They still write in a more Syrian style. They don't really have a whole lot of Judaism left in them. They're basically like borderline Muslims at this point. And quite a number of them are Christian too. Like there is a Christian Samaritan approach to things. And Jesus to some degree was influenced by them because Jesus, as you know, spoke Aramaic, not not Hebrew. Jesus could speak Hebrew because it was an academic language, but in Jesus' day, Hebrew was going extinct, and so Jesus spoke Aramaic, which was the language of the Samaritans and the northern Syrian and the Syrian people. Aramaic is similar to Hebrew, not quite the same. There are differences. You could compare Aramaic and Hebrew to something like Italian and Spanish. That's like same root words, different grammar, basically a few different grammar things. And so you can tell Jesus probably wasn't all that entirely Jewish himself because he wasn't speaking academic Hebrew. He was speaking Aramaic and Galilean Aramaic, which is like the country bumpkin language. And then the last group was the Essenes. The Essenes lived in the deserts of Sinai, and they were scattered in caves running from the Nile Delta to not the Nile Delta, not really Sinai, east of the Nile, up into the outskirts of the desert in the Dead Sea. So they lived in the coast and in the deserts and caves. They formed communes. They lived in small communities, and they famously hated the Jews. They were Jewish themselves, to be clear, but they hated Jerusalem Jews. They did not like the Jerusalem Jews. Famously, they all got up and left the government. They walked out. There's a thing called the Sanhedrin that's mentioned in the New Testament. This is like the kind of like the parliament of the region. Who's in the Sanhedrin is anyone's guess. You had primarily the Jews. It was the governing body of the Jews, but different groups of people came in there from Alexandria and Babylon, or Baghdad rather at that time. So the Sanhedrin was this like kind of like broad Pharisaical Sadducee governing parliament. And the Zealots were, I don't think they were ever members, but the Essenes were members at one point, and they famously walked out. They got fed up. They couldn't stand the Jews of Jerusalem. They condemned it all. They decided to say that the Second Temple was a farce. It should never have been built. It was all nonsense. And as far as they were concerned, the exile was still happening from the Babylonians. They were still in exile even in their own country because they spiritually hadn't departed from the sins that caused the exile. There's a whole lot of things you can read about the Essenes, but most famously, they wrote the Book of Enoch, the book I continue to come to. You can view Enoch as the magnum opus of sorts of the Essenes. It was their compiled. It was kind of like their Gospels. And the Essenes famously had a Trinitarian view of God, a good 100 to 300 years before Jesus. They had a Trinitarian view in which they viewed God as what they called the Ancient of Days, a father figure, the Son of Man, this prophesied coming of God, and the Lord of Spirits, the Holy Spirit. So it's very Christian. It's very Christian. They understand God as Father, Son, and Spirit, basically, in more than ways than they can. In vague ways, it was Father, Son, and Spirit. The Essenes also believed that a lot of the pagan religions around them were they weren't necessarily lies, but corruptions. So, like famously, the Essenes viewed Gilgamesh as a real person, and a biblical person. I think at one point they equate Gilgamesh to Nimrod. I'm not sure. There's debatable. It's debatable, but they do say Gilgamesh was a Nephilim giant of sorts that after the flood, and he was a real person, and that he's a character with deals with God. So like they kind of had a tendency to view the religions around them as a continuation of their own religion, not as much so much as competition as alternative, like, corruptions of the truth. So they were very open to talking to other groups of people, but they were very secretive and closed, and they kind of devoted themselves to godly living. They were the closest thing to having a trad life in the middle of nowhere that you can find, and it wasn't great. No one really attacked the Essenes, as far as I know. Like, I don't think there's any documented wars with them, like you have with the Zealots. They just kind of kept to themselves, and then once Christianity started, they kind of just disappeared. And there's pretty good reason to believe that the Essenes converted to Christianity. The most obvious one being that their literature ended up being canonical literature for the Ethiopians, and I think to a lesser degree the Coptics. I don't remember. So like you can imagine if you're like Philip or other apostles heading south, you convert a bunch of Essenes and you bring them along the way to Ethiopia to convert the Ethiopians. So we know that the Essenes disappear when Christianity comes, and that their books become they're quoted from in the Gospels. Jesus and Paul, I think both. No, Jesus and James both quote Enoch. I think Jesus does. I'm pretty sure Jesus does. I know James does. So they quote from the Essene literature. Some of the churches incorporate Essene literature into their liturgy and canon, and the Essenes themselves seem to just disappear afterwards. So there's a good reason to believe that they basically became Christians. They seem to have had a pretty good understanding of who Christ would be, like centuries before Christ arrived. Again, they did view God as a Trinity, and so they would be very open to Christ's claims because they basically believed them already. I argue that these signs indicate that a large portion of Christianity probably comes out of Essene tradition, not the Pharisee tradition. Now, I say that with a caveat. It is very obvious that Jesus and John the Baptist were both Pharisees. They come from Pharisee families. John the Baptist's father was a Pharisee and a high priest and one of the high priests of the temple. I don't know if he was he's a priest official. If you read Luke, I think. So like he was responsible for worship in the temple. So he was a Pharisee. So it seems like John the Baptist broke from the Pharisees and went to join the Essenes because the way he worships and practices in the desert is very Essene-like. The Pharisees coming to see John the Baptist in the New Testament, it's sometimes presented as who's this strange guy in the desert. Most of these Pharisees probably worked for his father. There's probably more like they're looking at this guy as like, why isn't he joining the priests like his father? The priests rotate, the high priests rotate between clans, and it's possible that his father's clan was up for re-election, and they were like, "Hey, John the Baptist, you want to be high priest? Wait, what the hell are you doing out here in the desert, half naked? What? Who are you? Your father was a great man. What would you become?" From the Jewish perspective, John the Baptist was probably like a child of anticipation, a child of promise, because his father went mute for 9 months or something when he was born, and like there was a miracle for his birth. There's some reason that the Jews might have thought that he was going to be a heroic figure. Famously they asked if he was the Christ because he fulfilled some of the ideas of Christ. And he was also born when that star constellation I mentioned was born. Happened. So like there was a possibility that from the Jewish perspective, maybe this John the Baptist guy was a Messiah, and he says, "No, I'm not." And then he goes out into the deserts and basically swears off his father's inheritance and becomes a desert Essene and is killed for it. Christ also appears to have given up his Pharisee status to some degree, at least, because he's called a Samaritan, he's called a desert guy, he's kind of rejected as a Jew by the Jews. Even though Mary and Elizabeth is John the Baptist's mother, and Mary they're related, so it's likely Jesus had in addition to his father Joseph being of the line of David, his mother was probably of the line of Levi, if not Levi, somehow related, because her cousin was the mother of a high priest. Maybe Mary's actually of the tribe of Judah, and they just married into the Levi tribe. I don't know. But anyway, that's a broad overview of why Christianity probably seems to come from an Essene tradition and not a Pharisee tradition. Like, Christianity seems to be a formalization of the rejection of Judaism, not from Judaism.
I think structurally that kind of checks out for the most part. I mean, you and I come from slightly different traditions. The Orthodox belief is that the church is both a spiritual body and a physical body. Now, in terms of spiritual praxis, I think you're right in terms of there are more parallels, there's more shared characteristics, there's more essence of the Essenes. And when we know that the book, the Catholics and Orthodox both agree that the book of Acts is the beginning, it's the founding of the church, right?
Yeah.
The structure of the church comes from the Holy Spirit, from the sign of the Holy Spirit, as told by Christ to wait for it right before his ascension. So the structure of that comes from that, not necessarily the Pharisee tradition. Structure itself is obviously important, but if you look at the early church, there's bishops, right? There's patriarchs of Antioch and whatnot, and then there's desert hermits. And you're probably right with your hunch about the Coptics, kind of carrying that Essene tradition, because Saint Christopher, all the desert fathers, Saint Mary of Egypt, so on and so forth. That's very reminiscent of an Essene tradition. So you have like this parallel to a Pharisee tradition that really was kind of built from a blank slate provided by God. But the Essene essence kind of remains in terms of the spiritual praxis. Like we have these spiritual disciplines that we maintain, but it's very easy for those to just be checkboxes. We're often called to go further as Christians, and that deep prayer, that deep concentration, and so not just prayer and scripture, but concentration with God and meditation with God in silence to understand our instruction of where we're supposed to walk. That's a very Essene thing to hold, but that's been what's described as authentic faith by many pre-schism saints, so on and so forth. So I think that's pretty sound. Maybe a lot of people who are new to the Christian faith, who are kind of in that Spurgeon mode at the very beginning, they'd hear what you're saying and they'd cry heresy. When it's just the opposite. It's providing more historical context and cultural context and anthropological context to something that surrounds our walk of faith. And if anything, it puts more things in perspective, and it helps us more in terms of apologetics and not necessarily debating pagans and ridiculous discourses online, but being able to state what it is that we believe and where it comes from in certain contexts that we may not have thought of in the past.
Yeah, one of the tragedies is because I haven't read the creeds in so long, I'm starting to forget them, and I kind of want to spend the rest of Easter like re-memorizing the creeds, because especially in the era we live in, I think we really have to get ready to the possibility of giving testimony before we're killed, right? This is a possibility that's increasingly possible, and if you can't preach the creeds with your last breath, you've kind of failed to be a witness to some degree, I think, but I won't judge. But I also feel like that claim that like you have to be able to say what you believe. We've suffered from 500 years of Protestant like mud, like flinging on the creeds and things that took centuries for men of great faith to develop really exact sciences around. Just were burned in the last like 500 years. It's kind of sad. Not even in the last 500 years, really in the last like 200 years, they were just all burned up and rejected, which is really just tragic. And that's really a heritage which we have to reclaim and rebuild, because it's been destroyed.
Agreed across the board. I don't want to take up too much of your time because you're on the East Coast. It's 11:30. I know you're sick. You and I could probably go on for hours, so I'd love to have you on again in the future. But where can people find you?
Yeah, I on Telegram I run that Restoration Bureau art channel, which is always it's always fun to find pagans not knowing who runs it and sharing my wonderful art, because it is very pro European in a lot of the style and an attempt to reinvigorate people's love of their origin. So I mean, by all means, the Restoration Bureau is one of the places on Telegram. On On Twitter, I'm Luthemplar, slightly different than what you see on the name there, but you can link it in the video in the video description later. And then on YouTube, I don't really have a YouTube channel. I do, but it's just like shitty music and readouts of shitty things. Same name though. Yeah. Actually, I think YouTube is just Luthemplar. Back when I was trying to be short from Luthemplar.
Well, sounds great. You can follow the artist formerly known as Cringewalker and Templar at on all the platforms he mentioned. Just some news on Blood and Rain's front. The Prismatic Orthodox podcast will be released soon. I'm having some trouble with the sound editing. There'll be another live guest this Friday, and more, within the bounds of Lent, Christian theology or content creators who are Orthodox, either or. More to come, and there will be another Careless Press panel podcast, and I'll be releasing an article on Careless Press very soon of why there's no peace without war. For those of you who know me, you know why this is something I want to write about. Thank you so much for being here. Really was a pleasure. Kind of scraped the surface of a lot of it's the tangents that get interesting. It's the tangents, I want to further explore in the future. I'm sure you will explore with your writing and my own research and probably further podcasts. But this is great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, if you want to end on, I can read that poem out from Virgil that might be a Roman prophecy of Christ.
Please.
Yeah, I've been reading it out for a little bit because ever since Columbus showed me it, I'm like in love with this poem a little bit. I'll where is it? Find it. Yeah. Oh, come on, give me the actual poetry and translation. Eclogue for the golden. It's titled The Golden Age. So, I might change a few words here because I know the Latin a little bit better than what's translated here. But anyway, it goes Muses of Sicily, let me sing a little more grandly. Orchards and humble tamarisks don't please everyone. And in the Latin, I think he's saying, let me prophecy. If I sing of the woods, let the woods be fit for counsel. Now the last stage of the Cumerian prophecy begins. The great roll call of the centuries born anew. Now virgin justice returns, and Saturn's reign. Now a new race descends from the heavens above. Only favor the child who's born, pure Lucian, under whom the first race of iron shall end, and a golden race shall rise up throughout the world. Now your Apollo reigns, for Pollio in your consulship, this noble age begins. And the noble the noble months begin their advance. Any traces of our evils that remain will be cancelled, while you lead and leave the earth free from perpetual fear. He will take on divine life, and he will see gods mingled with heroes, and be seen by them, and rule a peaceful world with his Father's power. And for you, boy, the uncultivated earth will pour out her first little gifts, straggling ivory, glimmering everywhere, and the bean flower and the smiling these are flower names I can't pronounce. the goats will come home themselves, their udders swollen with milk, and the cattle will have no fear of fierce lions. Your cradle itself will pour out delightful flowers, and the snakes will die, and the deceitful poisonous herbs will wither. Assyrian spice plants will spring up everywhere, and you will read both of heroic glories and your father's deeds, and will soon know what virtue can be. The plain will slowly turn golden with tender wheat, and the ripe clusters hang on the wild briars, and the tough oak drip with dew with wet honey. Some small traces of ancient era will lurk, that will command men to take to the sea ships, encircle towns with walls, plow the earth with furrows and furrows. Another Argo will arise to carry chosen heroes. A second Typhus will as helmsman. There will be another war, and a great Achilles will be sent out once more to another great Troy. Then when the strength of age has been made then when the strength of age has made you a man, the merchant himself will quit the sea, nor will the pine ship trade its goods, for every land will produce everything. The soil will not feel the hoe, nor the vine the pruning hook. The strong plowman too will free his oxen from the yoke. Wool will no longer be taught with counterfeit varied colors. The ram in the meadow will change his fierce himself, now to a sweet blushing purple, now to a saffron yellow. Scarlet will clothe the browsing lambs of its own accord. Let such ages roll on, the fates said, in harmony, to the spindle with the power of inexorable destiny. O dear child of the gods, take up your high honors. The time is near. Great son of Jupiter, see the world with the weighty dome bowing, earth and wide sea and deep heavens. See how everything delights in the future age. Oh, let the last days of a long life remain for me, and in this inseparation to tell how great your deeds will be. Thracian Orifice and Linnaeus will not overcome me in song. Though his mother helps the one, his father the other. Calliope's Orifice and lovely Apollo Linus. Even Pan, if he competes with me, with Arcadia as judge. Even great Pan with Arcadia as judge would account himself beaten. Little child, begin to recognize your mother with a smile. 10 months have brought a mother's long labor. Little child, begin, he on whom his parents do not smile. No god honors at his banquets, no goddess at her bed. It's quite a nice song, a poem, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's very fluttery, Greco-Roman, but there's a weight to it.
You might have heard quotes from Isaiah in there with like the lion and the lamb laying at peace, because he read Isaiah and he integrated some of the imagery from Isaiah into this. This was written about 30 years before Christ is born, and he was about 30 or 40 years old. So that line, like, please may me have the years to see you, it's really heart-wrenching, because he's going to die before Christ comes, and he's praying that he'll live just long enough to see the event.
Wow. Gosh, it's both beautiful and gut-wrenching when you think about it in context.
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was lovely. And thank you so much for being here. And to all the listeners, give a... How do I pronounce the new name?
What?
How do I pronounce the new name again? Sorry.
Luthemplar.
Luthemplar.
Yeah.
Give him a follow across platforms. They're fascinating reads. They're fascinating listens. And as always, listeners, good night, good storms. God bless. Thank you.
God bless.